If you clicked on this video looking for a summary of a failed multi-century attempt to recapture a small religiously relevant municipality, then you're in the right place. However, if you want to know why said campaign is significant in the broader context of world history, then I encourage you to give a look to these 3 videos linked on screen here on the history of Islam, Christianity, and Judaism, as well as this video on the broad religious history of the first millennium AD around the time of the Muslim conquest, which serves more or less as a direct context to these here Crusades. For some highly expedited backstory, Rome wasn't Christian, then it was, then part of it split off and became the Byzantine Empire, which owned Jerusalem for a good long while until it, well, didn't when Islam popped up and took it in part of its rapid conquest of Persia, the Levant, North Africa, and Spain. Then, 300 or so years later, the Seljuk Turks, who were also Muslim, conquered Anatolia, which made the Byzantines, who previously owned Anatolia, a little skittish, and our story begins from here. Pope Urban II heard news of this and, in my opinion, was likely excited for 2 possible reasons. First, if he called some sort of war to aid his fellow Christian kingdom, he would then have some really good leverage for asking the Greek Orthodox Byzantines to convert back to Roman Catholicism and end the recent schism between the churches. Second, if all of Europe was to be engaged in this, let's call it a cross-aid, then they'd have reason to stop fighting each other as they had been for the past few centuries. Win-win, right? So Urban takes up his keyboard and starts Deus Vult spamming like mad. Now it's about time for my routine disclaimer on the Crusades. It's no secret that I just don't like them. The moral and spiritual justifications for 9 bloody, repeated wars eludes me, to put it lightly. I get it, the Holy Land means a lot, but you need to call it a day after like 3 tries tops, not 9. I mostly like to describe the Crusades with the word messy. Like them or hate them, you have to agree that these wars were a mess from start to finish, plagued with infighting on all sides and barely effective, if effective at all. Yes, the Crusades were about religion and theoretically in service to God, but my point is that overall they did much more harm than good, even when the motive did come from a place of good faith. Remember, throughout history, religion has motivated and influenced a ton of events. But the participants were always still people, who would often do people-y things like compromise their religious beliefs for more human-scale motivations, like money, or land, or power, or mass murder. Like I explained in the case before, Christianity in itself isn't bad. It's just getting a twist from some very human factors, and Islam and Judaism engage in the same thing too on some occasions. It's hardly a reason to condemn an entire religion. So considering all that, I'm going to do my best to be fair, and I'll be rating all 9 Crusades based on how threatened Christendom was, how well they actually defended it, how much they at least tried to do something good, and finally how much needless looting and pillaging happened. Let's start with Crusade number 1. Originally, it set out to give the Byzantines their land back from the Seljuks. And while this may not be number 1 on God's priority list, it's still valid and justified from a certain perspective, so we're off to a decent start. Then after that they pushed south into the Levant, and then set about saving Jerusalem! Except Jerusalem was actually doing fine, and actually there was a bit of theological golden age budding at the time, which was pretty cool by most accounts, but nope, Siege pretty much trashed the city, so that's gonna get some points off, probably a yellow card in there too. After taking Jerusalem, the Crusaders set up a few kingdoms in the area and left a few soldiers behind, and then hightailed it home. So our first crusade comes out alright. The Byzantines were on the brink, and Europe came to its rescue. It was really more political and territorial than it was inherently religious in nature, but it's as fair as any other instance of allies helping allies. A holy city or 2 was sacked, but at least their heart was in the right place. And in the end, the Byzantines got some of their stuff back. This one I'm mostly good with. I'll give the first crusade a soft 4 Urbans out of 5. Next we have the Second Crusade, which, like the first, was called in response to a loss of Christian territory. In this case, the Turkish Zengid dynasty took over the Crusader state of Edessa, which was one of the many states founded by the Christians after the previous war ended. The difference with this crusade is that it failed. Horribly. This crusade, while theoretically noble and honorable in its aims, failed so horribly that I have to give it 2 participation awards out of 5. Third on our list is the, Third Crusade. Yeah, that one. This one was the cleanup crew for the Second Crusade, because after their failure weakened their holdings in the Holy Land, Jerusalem was taken by Saladin and his cool new Ayyubid Caliphate in 1187. Anyway, the Third Crusade is when things become squarely about Jerusalem, and this is also probably the one that you know best. Number 3 is known for such famous faces as Richard the Lionheart, Saladin, the plot of the original Assassin's Creed, all those fun guys. There are a bunch of fascinating, neat little stories from this one that I just don't have time to get into right now, but from a broad military history perspective, this one is also really cool because of how many factors are involved, how many cities are in play, and how many people volunteered. Of all the Crusades, this one is definitely the most religiously fervent. Morally justified or not, this one was motivated. Crusades 1 and 2 were really just about getting some land back, but Jerusalem had taken on a totally new religious significance in the 12th century that, from my perspective, is rather sudden and unexpected. But hey, it worked. People were volunteering by the thousands to quote-unquote rescue Jerusalem. Unfortunately, despite some solid victories won at Acre and Arsuf, albeit despite some non-negligible massacre in the former case, Richard and the Crusaders never managed to recapture Jerusalem. So despite genuine intentions to retake the city, it didn't pan out. I'll give the Third Crusade 3 Assassin's Creeds out of 4. Honor. So, we've talked about the Fourth Crusade before on this channel, and I really don't like talking about it. The Greek in me is just plain sad that Constantinople got sacked, and the Venice enthusiast in me feels guilty for being deeply enamored of the place that did the sacking. It's a lose-lose scenario for me. And I think the speed at which these guys just totally gave up on their divine quest to save Jerusalem in order to sack a fellow Christian city says a lot about what the Crusades really meant to some of the Crusaders, as we'll see later on especially. If you want to learn more about Constantinople getting sacked and the Byzantine Empire getting partitioned to the Crusaders, which, I mean, just look at this bloody mess of a map right here, watch one of these 2 videos. In the meantime, the Fourth Crusade gets -4 frustrated rants out of 4 stolen bronze horses. Can you tell that I'm salty about this? From here on out, the Crusades delve further and further into ineffective warmongering, as the protracted Fifth Crusade was called in 1213 to retake Jerusalem to ultimately disastrous ends, and so gets 1 starved-out army forcibly retreating out of 5. The Sixth Crusade, however, is much nicer since almost no actual fighting happened on account of the diplomatically adept Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II. Jerusalem was simply negotiated over to the Christians and no one went to hell for murder. Yay! This crusade gets a score of 3 Art of the Deals out of 5 disenchanted ghostwriters. The thing with the Sixth Crusade is that this one was called and waged by Frederick himself, not the Pope as the previous 5 had been. Also, shortly after this crusade ended, Jerusalem was sacked by the Muslims and almost completely destroyed. Now this, don't get me wrong, was a dick move through and through. One of the most important things to remember in history is that no matter how much you might want to attack or defend a culture, that culture is almost guaranteed to have done both great things and totally dickish things, and a black and white moral judgment is pretty much impossible as a result. Real history is complicated. Who knew? Anyway, following that trend of minimal papal oversight, the 7th and 8th Crusades, which Louis IX launched, and finally Henry III's 9th Crusade all set out to, say it with me, retake Jerusalem. For various reasons, they each, unsurprisingly, ended in failure, and they collectively get 1 Napoleon out of 5 rushes in the winter. Because at that point, why on earth are you still trying? Now that those are over, have you noticed that these affairs get rapidly less noble and religiously justifiable as time went on? The Crusades were each theoretically called to defend the cross, but the most they ever really did was defend some territory that happened to be owned by Christians in Crusades 1 and 2, and then after that the Crusaders all developed that really unhealthy obsession with Jerusalem. After War number 3, and after sacking number 2 at the most, we all need to agree to just go home and let it go. Tens, if not hundreds of thousands of Christians, Jews, and Muslims died in 2 centuries of war for a whole lot of nothing at the end of the day. Please let this be a lesson in when to quit. Now, it may seem like I'm just bashing on the idea of Christians crusading, but I maintain that there is one crusade that was never called, but should have been. If there was ever one instance in history in which Christianity as an idea, as a culture, as a way of life, was genuinely threatened and needed saving, it was the fall of Constantinople in 1453 to the Ottomans. Yeah, Jerusalem is cool, and it's really great to have your God's home city under your wing, but Constantinople was the world's foremost repository of classical and early Christian scholarship, as well as all manner of Christian art, and an incalculable amount of that was simply lost in the fall of the city. If there was ever a time that Christendom was really in peril, it was then, and neither the Pope nor the European powers did anything substantive to help. But here's why I personally think there wasn't one. There's a lot of land and loot to be had on the road to recapturing Jerusalem, but there's next to nothing to gain from helping someone else keep what they already have, even if they're also Christian. Although, given how the Fourth Crusade went, I wouldn't be surprised if the combined forces of Europe showed up to help the Ottomans besiege the city instead. So that's my rundown on the 9 Crusades that did happen and the one that didn't, but should've. As was the case with the last video, I highly suggest you watch part 3. This one takes a break from all the war and killing to cover the philosophical developments in Abrahamic culture, both during and after the time of the Crusades. It's very much the final bow to my big huge series on the Abrahamic religions, and I hope you enjoy it.